So this week we will discuss Come Follow Me, sections 46 through 48 of the Doctrine and Covenants, subtitle Walking Uprightly Before the Lord. So we're just going to kind of get right into the video today. And I really want to focus on verse 1 and 7 of section 46. What is unique about this section, it's not the only unique thing, or it's not the only time this happens, but if you pay attention to Doctrine and Covenants, the Lord is sometimes addressing the elders of the church, and then in other cases, he addresses the people of the church. And so one is more selective versus the other. Here, section 46 is an address or revelation to the people of his church. Therefore, it's not just limited to the elders, but to the members as a whole. And one of the commandments he gives is in verse 7, and it's unique. And I want to talk more about it because I think sometimes we just gloss over and fail to do a closer reading of what the Lord is exactly commanding the members to do. So he says, "But ye," so that's the people of my church. And is one thing that's really helpful is the ye, while it is Old English, it also refers to the you in a plural form. So in modern English, we do not have a plural you. We have to say you all, or the context implies that we're referring to more than one person. Other languages, that's different. Um, and so with English, we don't have that anymore. We did apparently with the King James Old English. We did have that, and then somehow got lost, which is a shame because it does add some clarity. But as you can see here, it says, "But ye," so he's referring to the people of the church, not just one person, "are commanded in all things to ask of God, who giveth liberally, and that which the Spirit testifies, declares, or witnesses unto you, even so, that ye should do in all holiness of heart, walking uprightly before me, considering the end of your salvation, doing all things with prayer and thanksgiving, that ye may not be seduced by evil spirits, or doctrines of devils, or the commandments of men. For some of our men, and others of devils." So the focus here is obviously on the bolded. So what we have is the Lord commands the people of the church to do something, and that is to ask God in all things. And that's because God gives liberally. And we know that from James, I think chapter 2 is, or maybe chapter 1. We all know that passage, though. If any of you lack wisdom, let him ask of God, that give it to all men liberally, right? So there's drawing from that. So God gives freely. That's what it means liberally in this context. And then that which the Spirit testifies unto you, even so I would that you should do. So let's just stop there. So we have a command, and we're commanded to ask God in all things. And then that which the Spirit testifies, we are to do. And then it tells us how we are to do that. In all holiness of heart, walking uprightly before me. So one of the questions is what should we ask God up or God for? There are many things in our lives, sure, interests that we have. And it sounds kind of tempting to be like, wow, we can ask God for anything. It's almost kind of conjures up the idea of a genie in a lamp, right? And I think sometimes many of us treat God as a genie, as a way to get goodies from him. And that is not necessarily incorrect in the sense that we can receive according to the desires of our heart. For example, Alma, when he is writing the psalm and he wants to be an angel and he desires that, well, what we might not realize is that Alma appears to have gotten that wish because, for all intents and purposes, it appears that Alma was translated. And we know from Joseph Smith that translated beings are translated, so that they can do further work on the earth before they become celestial. And so it appears that Alma got his wish. And we see that constantly throughout the scriptures, that God rewards according to our desires. And it's very possible, at least I believe, that if you want even something that is not necessarily expedient, but you really want it, you desire it, and it's your focus, God will give it to you. Now, the question is whether that is for your benefit or not. That's a separate question. But there is some element of God being, some truth to the idea that God is not a genie, though, I want to be clear, but that God gives us what we desire. So the question then is, if God is like that, and he's willing to give us the desires of our hearts, what should we ask of God? Well, let me give you an idea of what David asked God for. And also, we can then look at what Paul has counseled the church and kind of go from there. So in Psalms 139, I believe this is David, it says, "Search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me and know my thoughts." And there's a commentary that explains that this phrase is a plea for divine examination and introspection. The psalmist invites God to search his innermost being, reflecting a deep desire for purity and alignment with God's will. So at least according, and maybe it's not David, just the psalmist, it's some person who has written a psalm, is this person wants God to examine him. And as I share this, I also am reminded of King Solomon, whom the Lord visited, or at least, the Lord spoke with and granted him according to the desires of his heart. And I should have had this included, but I didn't realize it at the time. But what's interesting is, instead of asking for riches, instead of asking for otherworldly things, maybe, or other gifts of the Spirit, Solomon asked for an understanding heart. That is, for discernment. He wanted, in other words, to be wise. And there's a connection between being wise and being examined by the Lord, because in order to be wise, we need to know where we are falling short. Otherwise, we can't be wise, or our wisdom is limited. And so for Solomon, and we also now have Corinthians, where Paul tells the saints in Corinth to examine yourselves and see whether you be in Christ or not. And so when it comes to asking God in our prayers in all things, now that's true, all things includes all things, but probably the most important thing to ask for is wisdom, or light and truth. And even I can say specifically guidance and correction, which I have referred to before as the rod and staff. And that gets used, at least by David, to refer to both this idea of guidance and correction, right? Because a rod, well, I have it, that doesn't, not parallel, but you have guidance, which is connected to the staff, right? Like a shepherd's staff guiding the sheep. And you have the rod, which is connected with correction or discipline. And we need both of those, because sometimes, and in fact, to be guided requires correction, because we might be on the wrong path and we have to be reminded that we're on the wrong one. And so that often comes from correction. But anyways, it's this two-part kind of reception of truth, which comes either from the form of guidance or correction. And this is kind of indicated even in the verse. If we go back, the Lord says, ask in all things to ask of God who giveth liberty, and that which the Spirit testifies unto you, even so I would that you should do. And so it seems that the Lord is kind of giving a hint as to what they should be asking, basically saying, ask me for what truth you need, and then do what I tell you to do. And so what I want to suggest is that in our prayers, instead of maybe going for the desires of our carnal heart, and maybe we are wanting a promotion at work, or we're wanting to have our material circumstances secure, that we are looking for some comfort. Instead of going that direction, let us look and ask for ways to improve. Because the real purpose of commandments are for our progression. God gives us commandments to give us light. And they're not simply things that we follow to show fealty to God, although obviously if you are obedient to the commandments you are, but it's what I want to make clear is it's not that simply following commandments earns the favor of God. It is becoming what those commandments lead us to become. And so what I want to encourage us is that in our prayers, let's try seeking for light and truth, for ways to improve, instead of seeking maybe the other things that we think are more pleasing. But there's also more. And so the Lord tells us that we are to do what the Spirit directs, and then He provides two ways or manner in how we are to do that. And that is in all holiness of heart and walking uprightly before the Lord. So let's delve into these things. So holiness has a few different meanings, and that's because we have the 1828 meaning, which is, again, the meaning that Joseph Smith and the members of the church likely would have understood the words. This is the 1828 dictionary. And then we also have the Hebrew meaning. And there's some similarities, but it looks like the 1828 is a little bit more robust than the Hebrew meaning, which is not bad. Just pointing that out. It gives a little more nuance. But there is holiness, which is a state of being holy. That's not very helpful. But where it does become helpful is this idea of purity, freedom from sin. That's really interesting, right? To be holy is free from sin. And then this idea of consecrated. There's some other things here, but I'm kind of picking out the definitions that I think are useful for us. And then we go on to the Hebrew meaning. And the Hebrew meaning is a lot more narrow, if I may say, and it really has to do with being separate. And so, unlike this idea of this kind of quality, I think sometimes when we think of holiness, we think of this kind of abstract quality someone possesses. And while that may be true in the Hebrew meaning, which I think is useful for us, the Hebrew meaning is more about just simply being set apart. Kadosh is the Hebrew word, and it means to be set apart or separate, right? So the rituals of the Levitical law were to create holiness because they were to create a distinction between the holy and the profane or the common. And so we have this idea of separateness, set apart, and that's kind of matches with this idea of consecrated, or that more of the idea of dedicated. But again, we have here dedicated or consecrated to God. And we see that in the scriptures, there are certain objects or people who can be dedicated to God. So these are Nazarites, firstborn sons. Mount Sinai, the priests were dedicated to God, and they lived in a way that was different. I'm talking about the Levitical priests or the Aaronic priests during the law of Moses, is that they were distinct in the way they lived and the way they consumed the food. Like they got their food from the offerings, not the way other people did, because their life was fully devoted to the service of God, and the way they got remunerated for that was through the offerings that they could eat. Now, some they couldn't eat, some had to be completely consumed, but that's beside the point. The point is that there's idea of holiness can mean this idea of being consecrated or dedicated. So let's just put a plug in that or a pin in that, and then we'll come back to that. And then I want to talk about this idea of the heart. So we got holiness of heart. We got to connect the two, and then we have so it's more than an organ. Interesting. I typed this in GPT and it said command center, and so the heart really is like the inner center being of us. Our English doesn't have a word to really describe that, so I'm struggling to come up with a way to say that, but that's essentially what it is. And it includes all of these things: the mind, will, emotions, or conscience. That's the heart. Okay, so let's kind of table that. We're going to now look at walking uprightly, because those are the two things that we are to do: holiness of heart, walking uprightly before the Lord. And then walking uprightly is interesting because we have the definition is to be, and this is from the 1828, I didn't specify, but it's to be honest, just, adhering to rectitude in all social intercourse, not deviating from correct moral principles, conformable to moral rectitude. So that's an interesting word. And so I have what rectitude means, 1828 definition, means immorality, rightness of principle or practice, uprightness of mind, exact conformity to truth or to the rules prescribed for moral conduct, either by divine or human laws. Rectitude of mind is a disposition to act in conformity to any known standard of right, truth, or justice. Rectitude of conduct is the actual conformity to such standard. So that's a pretty robust definition. And I think the best way to summarize moral rectitude is conformity to truth, conformity to what is right, to what is correct, and not deviating from that. So upright, the term upright is a really unique term. And you can see kind of how this meaning came about, because if you're upright, you're straight, you're not bent, right? And the scriptures always have this idea of being bent, crooked, the crooked way, to link it to evil, whereas straight and narrow, um, uh, upright, again, this conveys this idea of straightness, not deviating, not bending to anything. And so we're to walk uprightly. Okay, so now let's put this together. At least this will be my attempt. So we do what the Spirit directs in all holiness of heart, which means we are to be consecrated to the Spirit's direction. So I think that's where the Lord is saying. He's saying, what the Spirit directs, do it in all holiness of heart, means that we are consecrated completely to what it says. We don't deviate from what the Spirit, we don't rationalize, we don't try to, um, come up with some alternative way to do what the Spirit is directing us to do. We are committed to what it says. And there's a great, and I didn't provide the name of the hymn, but it's I can't remember at the time. It's Orson Hyde wrote it. The Savior, Redeemer of my love, and in one of the verses, very beautiful, and it's one of my favorite hymns because it encapsulates the heart, so to speak, of the believer. It says, "Never can I repay thee, Lord, but I can love thee, thy pure word." So how does he repay? By loving the pure word of God. And hath it, thy word, so that it, not been my one delight. So the word is my delight. Remember, we've talked about in other videos, is the word is truth. It's light and truth. So truth has been my delight, my joy by day, my dream by night. Again, feasting upon the truth, feasting upon the words of Christ, feasting upon the truth that he has. That's his delight. And just as we talked about before, that's what we should seek for, is truth and light. Then my lips proclaim it still. Proclaim it is the word. And all my life reflect thy will. So never can I repay thee, Lord, but I can love thee, thy pure word. Hath the truth not been my one delight? It is my joy by day, my dream by night. Then let my lips proclaim the truth still, and all my life reflect thy will. And so this idea then here is person committed to the truth, wanting to proclaim it, and then having his life reflect exactly what the will of the Lord is. It's very beautiful, and it captures exactly what the attitude of a believer should be, and especially a regenerated Christian or follower of Christ should be. And then the next is we have walking uprightly, which is to do what the Spirit says in strict conformity to truth. And so what we have here is we have two ways, and it says and too. So at the very beginning it says and. It's not or. Well, it's actually, it has a comma, but that would mean that they're connected. And so it says, do what the Spirit directs, being consecrated to it, and being strictly conformed to the truth in how you do it. And so you do exactly what it says, and you do that what's in conformity to the truth. So if the Spirit directs you to speak to someone, you do what the Spirit directs, and then the way you speak to them is based on your conformity of truth and of honesty. And that's essentially what's going on here is the Lord is saying, be honest when you carry out my commands. And this idea of honesty is not discussed as often as it should be. And I think one really good verse to finish, because I want to talk a little bit more about honesty, is Psalm 24, verse 3. And this is one of my favorite verses. And it talks about, well, that's the question, who can ascend into the hill of the Lord? And the hill, as I have noted below, is the mountain of the Lord. It should be translated mountain. So who shall ascend into the mountain of the Lord? And if you remember from last video, Isaiah 2 talks about, I believe it's Isaiah 2, working from memory here, but about all these nations flowing to the mountain of the Lord. The mountain of the Lord is where the Lord dwells. It is Zion. It is the celestial kingdom. It is the abode of the Lord. It is Mount Sinai. It is all those instances where people have, often in scriptures, people have divine encounters on mountains. Mountains represent the presence of the Lord. So it's saying, who can ascend the mountain? Remember, you have to ascend, and this echoes from the Israelites in the wilderness with Sinai. Who can ascend unto the hill of the Lord? So who can climb up the mountain, just like Moses did? Or who shall stand in his holy place? Right? So who's be able to ascend and then be able to remain? So there are two different things there. You can ascend, but can you remain in the abode of God? And then it says exactly who can do that. He that hath clean hands and a pure heart, who hath not lifted up his soul unto vanity, nor sworn deceitfully. So we'll just quickly touch on the clean hands and pure heart. That refers to action and intention, right? Hands, what you do. Heart is in the inner. So the inner and outer are both pure, are clean, are righteous. And then it says, so you have to have that. So you have to have the works. It's not just the works alone. It's not just doing the rituals. It is also the inner sincerity of the person, whether the person's sincere in what they are practicing, what they are doing. So there's that component, right? The Lord doesn't just want us to do things. It's also who we are becoming on the inside. And then there's also another thing so it's inner and outer, and those who have not lifted up his soul unto vanity, nor sworn deceitfully. Now, vanity, that definition is not very clear in the King James, but the proper translation, and at least some translations do this, and I agree with them, should I say. I'm no scholar in biblical languages, but I've looked at the translations, and I think the most fitting one, that makes sense, is falsehood. And here's why. Because first of all, they have these couplets that are parallels in Psalm. And so often they're referring to the same thing, just at a different level. And so here it makes more sense to say, lift up his soul, is not lift up his soul unto falsehood, nor sworn deceitfully. They're both dealing with kind of this idea of dishonesty, but in different ways. So let's talk about those different ways. So someone who can ascend and abide in the presence of the Lord must not accept falsehood. So lifted up is interesting because it applies this idea of being elevated, being prideful, arrogant, right? And that's also kind of what lies do, is they cause us to believe things about ourselves aren't true, and we get puffed up, right? So the one thing is, not lifting his soul into vanity means not lifting his soul into falsehood. That is accepting lies. So that's more of a general thing. And then it goes, nor sworn deceitfully, which is not engaging in lies. So there's a distinction there. And the psalmist, if it is David, captures this beautifully, because he captures both ideas. Because some people they don't engage in lies, but they accept them. right? They go along with the lies that people say. They might not lie themselves, but they accept what other people say, and so forth. But notice the requirement: he that can abide in God's presence must not lift his soul into vanity or to falsehood. So he can't accept the lie. But then it goes on to say, nor engage in lies. And so, once again, we have what we've talked about last week as well is when it comes to seeking for light and truth, ultimately what we are doing is we're seeking for to be honest, because you can't possess the truth and be a dishonest person, because the truth and honesty go hand in hand. And so when we seek for truth, it's not just the truth that comes from like the mysteries of God. You see people on YouTube who go into these ideas about the second coming and so forth. They might be right or whatever, but the ultimate truth we should possess or seek after, the truth that matters, or the truth that, should I say, that is part of a component of seeking for truth is also seeking to be honest. And so it's not just the mysteries alone, but it is any truth that reveals to us something about ourselves that we need to adopt and conform to. And that's what the Lord is commanding. That's what the Lord commanded the church in the early church, and that would still apply today. And encourage you to seek for that light and truth. Identify ways that you can be honest. Identify areas where you are dishonest, make that correction, and see what goodness flows from that.